All right, so give me your elevator pitch on why you're running for governor, and not just that, but also why people should break from the major party candidates and vote for you.
Well, sure. I mean, after 2016 in America, I think politics is broken. Republicans don't know if they're Republicans anymore. Democrats don't know if they're Democrats anymore. And the Libertarian Party has been a consistent outsider for decades. I mean, they were started in 1971. I was born in 1983. And here we are at a point in American politics where I think libertarian ideas are more popular than ever. In 2016, the millennial generation voted for Gary Johnson, our presidential nominee, by 25% right here in Ohio. And that's with all the media and money working against them. So I think we have a lot to offer. I think we have some pro-freedom alternatives to the big major party candidates. We're not establishment career politicians. We're a lot of volunteers and activists looking to bring more ideas into the political arena.
Now, your website lists the top 3 ideas for your platform are tax and regulatory reform, criminal justice reform, and legalizing marijuana. You also mentioned fixing Medicaid. I want to start with that because that's been a big issue for the major party candidates. Both candidates, the major party candidates, have said they support Medicaid expansion, but Mike DeWine has said he wants some changes in that. You've said you want a more free market approach to Medicaid and that you'll roll back Medicaid expansion. But Governor Kasich's campaign has said that it's helped thousands of people with treatable conditions, people who are battling opioid addiction. How would you do that to take away medical coverage for 700,000 people who are seemingly getting some benefit out of it?
Right. Well, the Medicaid expansion issue is actually very divisive on the conservative side. And I actually reject the notion that conservatives and libertarians don't want people to have health care. It's actually just a matter of government-run health care, especially in this country, is the most expensive and least efficient way of getting it done. So yes, we have 700,000 Ohioans with health care, but it's to the cost of hundreds of millions of dollars. So that's where the problem comes in. And what we've proposed is not just cutting everyone off overnight. I want to do a rollback. It's a similar approach that Ron Paul had to cutting things like Medicaid and Medicare, because we don't want to leave these people just without coverage. But we want to roll it back, and I would only sign legislation. And we know the state legislature full of Republicans, they want to do this. They don't like the way Kasich went about this Medicaid expansion. And so we would only sign legislation that opens up the healthcare industry to the free market. And this means things like challenging federal healthcare laws. I want Ohioans to be able to buy health insurance across state lines. They're not allowed to do that. Right now we need to deregulate the health insurance industry to a point where people can just buy catastrophic care plans. They're not allowed to do that right now. I have another idea that's being proposed by Jared Polis, a Democrat running for governor in Colorado. It's actually another idea that's been agreed upon by Bernie Sanders and Ted Cruz in a CNN town hall, and that is allowing citizens to buy prescription drugs from Canada and other countries. We can't do that right now, but we could do it on a state level. So I want to bring down cost for Ohioans when it comes to health insurance and prescription drugs without expanding government and just expanding the free market and their access to these things through that way.
There's been a lot of discussion when you talk about federal policy, too, on protecting people with pre-existing conditions from losing their health care coverage. As governor, what would you do about that?
Well, I mean, again, it's a federal issue, but actually we talked about this on the radio the other day. In terms of pre-existing conditions, what I would like to see, and of course this is not guaranteed, is that the good health insurance companies will just offer to cover pre-existing conditions anyway. I mean, that's, you know, I'm a small businessman, I'm an entrepreneur. Sometimes you take a risk and sometimes you take a loss on some policies. A good company knows when to cover people, even if it means it's going to cost you a little bit of money in the long run. And in theory, if the free market works the way we want it to work, the companies that do offer coverage for pre-existing conditions will make more money because more people will buy into their insurance plans.
On taxes, you want less regulation and taxes on businesses and less government spending. Well, how do you fund some of the things that people say they want from their government if indeed there'd be less money to spend on those things?
Well, we always want to ensure the most the most practical government services. It's not about cutting those, but it's about cutting a lot of the pork projects that get packed into the budget. I mean, the balanced budget amendment that we have in Ohio is a bit of a misnomer because the more money we bring in, the more money everyone feels like spending. You know, an example would be $4 million for a soccer stadium down in Cincinnati. For starters, I'm a Crew fan, so sorry, you're on your own. But, you know, this is an issue that if it went in front of the taxpayers in Cincinnati, it would fail 8 times out of 10. But still, someone got it into Kasich's budget. So we got to start cutting pork projects. There are plenty of other areas that we can go through, and, you know, I'll have line item veto power. I've joked with Tea Party groups that I'm going to need more pens when I get my hand on that budget, but it really does come down to it. We keep the essential services, but you start to cut a lot of the waste, fraud, and abuse. And we all know that there is that. Even Dennis Kucinich said that he would get in on this budget and cut 10% across the board. So there are ways to cut. In terms of regulations and small business taxes, what I want to see is deregulating not just small businesses and encouraging innovation right here in Ohio. Jobs Ohio, for example, needs to be transparent. It needs to be susceptible to an audit. And it's not just about bringing in businesses from outside Ohio. It's about letting businesses start here and flourish here. And that includes industries that were already stifling. Medical marijuana has been overregulated, can't take off. Even our gambling industry is overregulated. Breweries, micro-distilleries, they've slowly been deregulated, and you've seen how much they've taken off. But in my talks with brewers and people who work at micro-distilleries, even these can be deregulated more so they can flourish even more. Then you're bringing in more honest tax revenue that's earned from economic means as opposed to overtaxing other people in different areas.
One of the other things that you talk about is criminal justice reform. What does that look like to you?
Well, frankly, issue 1 is a very contentious ballot initiative right now, but in a libertarian government, we wouldn't even need it. We would have divested from putting people in prison a long time ago. I mean, if we, released all the nonviolent drug offenders that we have in prison right now, we would save over $500 million a year that we put into prisons. And we are putting these people in the cages, and it's not helping them, right? This is what issue 1 tends to be about. It's not treating the drug problem as a criminal problem. We need to treat it as a health problem. And what we find is it's much more affordable to do it that way. You pay a fraction of the cost to treat addicts and people who need rehab and treatment as such, as opposed to what we have now, and that is just throwing them in a cage and hoping they get better. So for me, this is a conservative issue and a progressive issue. Progressives can agree with the morals of it, but conservatives should really get on board with this because it's going to start saving them taxpayer money.
So you think issue 1 is the solution for criminal justice reform?
I don't think it's perfect. I don't think it's the end of the world if it passes. There's a lot of fear being conjured up on both sides of issue 1, unfortunately. And again, I see the flaws in it, but I recognize why this has happened. It's because the state legislature has done nothing on the opioid crisis issue, and we're number 2 in the nation. And I'm a millennial. It's ravaging my generation. It knows no color, creed, or class. I'm from Bexley. I had a friend I played football with. I went to his funeral in March. I mean, it's really, I want whoever gets elected, in the unlikely event I'm not governor, we do need to deal with this. And whether issue 1 passes or not, the state legislature needs to get on it.
Let's talk a little bit about Second Amendment rights. You have been opposed to gun control regulations that Governor John Kasich has proposed, a red flag law, some bans on things like bump stocks and that sort of thing. Polls show most people want those kind of proposals, though, but it's not like they're moving in the legislature. So what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, what we've seen from Mike DeWine is a complete, well, we don't know where he stands because he's had a record of proposing gun control when he was a senator. There's a lot of people upset with him about that, but then he goes and gets the endorsement from the NRA and some other gun groups here in Ohio. I would work with the Republican state legislature better than Mike DeWine would on implementing Second Amendment rights. I mean, I am against gun control. A story just came out this week about how Kasich's endorsement came at a price. He wants DeWine to continue to push his gun control legislation. And look, as a former political journalist myself, Vice has done a great piece on the red flag law that went in effect in Washington State. And it's a very gray area. You start going over to people's homes, they haven't done anything wrong, but they just bought a bunch of guns, so they've been flagged. It's a very slippery slope on this legislation. So even if it's polling well with some people, I know with our base, the Libertarian base and conservatives, we are getting a lot of support from people who are absolutely scared that Mike DeWine or Rich Cordray would take their guns. And
there's an area where you and the legislature seem to agree when it comes to gun regulation. There's an area where you don't agree, and you've mentioned it already, Jobs Ohio. The legislature put some controls on Jobs Ohio in terms of what can be transparent, what can't be. So you say you want to make it more transparent. How would you work with this legislature, who's likely to be the same members for the most part, though there will be some changes, to try to get more transparency?
I would hope that the Republican state legislature would be in favor of more transparency. Again, I've actually spoken to a lot of state legislators, Republicans who do not support Mike DeWine. I can't reveal their names, or he'll probably call them and ask them to resign. That seems to be his style. But no, I would be very confident that if I'm able to work with the state legislature on issues like rolling back Medicaid expansion and protecting Second Amendment rights, I would hope that they would help us make Jobs Ohio and all of the departments in Kasich's administration moving forward. I would really hope they'd let us become make them more transparent across the board.
One of the things that you and your fellow minor party candidate Constance Goodell-Dutton do agree on is legalizing marijuana. You mentioned that earlier. What does that look like in Ohio, and is there a benefit for Ohio to doing that? There seems to be some concern about what that would bring.
I think it'd be very beneficial. Again, second in the nation right now on the opioid crisis. More than 4,000 people died in 2017. That's more people who died in 9/11. So we do have an emergency on our hands. And what we've seen in states where they do have medical marijuana or legal marijuana is that the opioid crisis is scientifically 25% less deadly, harmful, and expensive, right? We're already putting $1 billion to fight the opioid crisis. And, Mike DeWine's announced this convoluted 12-point plan. It's like, this can be a 2-point plan. Number one, fast track our medical marijuana program, which was passed 2 years ago, should have been implemented a month ago. And once we do that, we do prepare for fully legal marijuana. So people have a safer legal alternative as opposed to opioids. Marijuana has also been proven to help wean people off opioids and heroin. And then once you do that, step 2 of the plan is use that tax revenue. It's just going to be honest earned tax revenue, as long as we don't over-regulate it like they're doing now. All of that coming in, then that can be pumped back into the rehab and treatment when it comes to addiction and drug felons. I mean, again, this is just a no-brainer. We can literally fight this while making money at the same time. So I really hope, I think, Constance and I are on the same page on this. I really hope Republicans and Democrats get on the same page too.
I have some generic questions about your campaign in general here. You've launched a TV ad in the final few days here before Election Day, targeting Governor John Kasich, who has endorsed Mike DeWine, and you impersonate him and say, if you become governor, then he will never become president. What do you mean by that? And I mean, you're not running against Kasich, and he's not on the ballot. What do you mean by that?
Right. Well, in a way, we're all kind of running against Kasich, except DeWine has now embraced the the endorsement of John Kasich. What we found with Republicans and Democrats across the board is that Kasich is very unpopular. I do think, after 2014, I knew right away that he was gunning up for a presidential run in 2016, and you can see him putting in the same type of steps now, the way that he's never in Ohio. He always seems to be stuffing his face somewhere in New Hampshire. So I think he's preparing to run for 2020, absolutely. But we are running against his policies, and DeWine is going to be Kasich 2.0. I would say Cordray has already said that he's going to keep a lot of the things that Kasich put in place. So when we run against Kasich and we put him in our ads, our caricature of him, John K. Sucks, we are taking him on for what he's done to Ohio for the 8 years. There are some things that I agree with him on. I think it's good that we have $3 billion in the rainy day fund. I think that's good. I do respect the fact that he's made bedhead an acceptable hairstyle for a governor. But beyond that, I don't agree with Kasich on much.
Okay, that last comment there could maybe hint to you do have a background in comedy. You do enjoy telling jokes and that sort of thing. I want to ask you, though, some people might say, hey, this speaks to people not believing that you're a serious candidate. A candidate that can govern a state of 11.5 million people with a $32 billion state budget and a serious opioid problem. How do you convince people that you are serious?
Well, I mean, it's a great question. I would just point to my political record of running for mayor of Bexley. I did a good job there, even though I didn't win. A lot of my ideas about saving money from our city budget, as well as stopping Capital University from buying up homes and things like that, those ideas were implemented. So that's all documented in our documentary American Mayor. Which is on Amazon Prime, just to show how young people can run and make a difference. I worked on Capitol Hill after that. I ran for Congress in 2010, and I warned about the big fiscal crisis in Washington. We had a $16 trillion debt under a Democrat president then. Now we're approaching a $22 trillion debt under a Republican president. I have a degree from Columbia Journalism School. I've been involved with 2 presidential campaigns with Gary Johnson. So I've been active in my political efforts, and all I think that my humor and my comedy sensibilities help bring to this race is I'm able to talk to crowds. I'm actually a lot easier to converse with than the Republicans and Democrats. I mean, Mike DeWine and Cordray really don't seem to like each other. They were arguing like an old married couple in the Cleveland.com editorial board meeting. And one of the moments, the board said that I brought a lot of levity to that meeting. I kept offering to sit in between them. And then at the very end, they started arguing about that rape kit issue that they seemed to hate each other over. And, even the press has pointed out that, look, they both did a good job at making the rape kit issue more effective when they were attorneys general. So I pointed that out to them. I asked them to shake hands and congratulate each other for doing that. And when they did that reluctantly, as I point out to the editorial board, if I could do that, just imagine what I could do with the state legislature. legislature.
Now, Libertarian candidates are often seen as spoilers for Republican candidates. So if Mike DeWine does lose by the margin that you get, how will that affect you?
Well, I mean, look, we're bringing in support from both sides at this point. We have Democrats supporting us who do not like Rich Cordray, and yes, definitely Republicans who don't like Mike DeWine supporting us over the gun issue, Medicaid expansion, things like that. But we also have our standard independents, libertarians, non-voters, and what I'm more excited about is new voters, these 18-year-olds who are voting for their first election ever, and they're coming up to me and saying they're voting for me for governor. So, you know, I reject the idea of a spoiler. I understand why it exists, but to paraphrase the Libertarian Chairman Nicholas Sarwark after 2016, in a message to the major parties, look, your parties will die and your tears are delicious. If you had run better candidates, you wouldn't have to blame me right now.
And finally, a lot of this, I think, for minor parties is that 3% threshold that you're trying to get. I mean, there was no Libertarian candidate on the ballot in 2014 because of a law that specifically relates to this. Is your candidacy more about trying to get that 3% threshold, or do you really think that you can win? I mean, realistically.
Well, I mean, we're in the final week, and I think we understand where we are. If we had been able to participate in the debates, if we had been included in polls, if we had ballot access, as you've mentioned, for the last 4 years. I mean, my goodness. 2013, the Republicans passed this law, SB 193, which redefines minor party ballot access, 3% in a governor's race or presidential race for us to keep ballot access for 4 years. Then they pulled another dirty trick on us, though, when they kicked off Charlie Earl, our gubernatorial candidate in 2014, off the ballot, off a signature technicality that had never been enforced before. Now, if Charlie Earl had been included that year, I have no doubt we would have met that 3% threshold, and we would have ballot access the last 4 years. And you would actually probably see some elected libertarians in some of these state rep races where Republicans run unopposed over and over. I mean, we have elected libertarians in other states across the country, but just this year we had to get back our ballot access. And that's what, yes, my race is also about.
But in the previous two elections, you only got 2.39% and 1.78%. So 3% is a pretty big threshold if you can actually get to that.
Right. Well, but then Gary Johnson did get 3% in 2016, but he had to run as an independent. And of course, Husted and the Republican-run courts didn't count our 3% with Gary Johnson as libertarian results. So if I do crack the 3%, and we hope to get much higher, I think what will be exciting is that will be a historic high, I think, for a third-party candidate for governor of Ohio. So if we're going to break records this year, hey, that's a step forward.